All right, let's see if we're live over here. Refresh. I think we are. Okay, check it out. All right. So I'm joining the live over on my computer so I can pick up any chats or comments as we go along and through. I'm experimenting with a couple different kinds of streaming software, so please be patient as I figure this out. Thought about jumping in today with Bible study software, but I so much love doing these with this book that I wanted to figure out a way to share it directly. All right. Given that this is my first actual live stream, most of my Bible studies up to this point have been pre-recorded. And so figuring this out. However, let's get started. Ezekiel chapter 22 is probably not a chapter that you would pick on your regular day for a Bible study. Just happens to be where I opened the book today, and that's my strategy because by simply opening the book, A, I allow chance to take me to very interesting places, and B, I end up uncovering chapters and ideas and things that I probably wouldn't have chosen to go explore. But I started reading. I read the first 3 verses and I'm like, 22 is a good chapter. Let's start here because at least there's one thing I know that I want to talk about. And of course, any chapter is a great place to start in the Bible, especially once you have been through the book and kind of have some idea of how it progresses. So here we begin, Ezekiel chapter 22. Let's take a look at who Ezekiel is. And fortunately, I study Bible, so we can look at this. And at the beginning of the book, so if you're an ancient writer and you want somebody to know who you are, kind of the context of your writing, you might begin the book by saying, here's when this was written. It's the 30th year, 4th month, 5th day of the month. And 30th year must have been 30th year after the nation of Israel was carried to Babylon. It looks like 5th year after the exile of King Jehoiachin. So this is very interesting because King Jehoiachin was actually exiled after the first time the captives were carried away. There's a good chance that Ezekiel, given this, could have been friends with Daniel, who was one of the first people to be carried away when the nation of Israel was conquered by the nation of Babylon. So the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. How does Ezekiel define himself? This is fascinating. I don't think I've ever noticed this before. The priest. And sadly, I did not share the study that I did on Malachi. I still have to go back and put that back in. But Malachi is written to the priests, and the priests receive a lot of emphasis throughout these books of prophecy that are in the last part of the Old Testament. And so, very interesting. I never realized Ezekiel was a priest. So he's in the land of the Chaldeans. The hand of the Lord was upon him there. Now that's an interesting piece because if you look through the Bible, and perhaps you could do a word study on this, but there's the hand of the Lord. You have people refer to the finger of God and to the arm of God, and this has to do with like the strength of power with which somebody is experiencing God. You also have other things like the name of the Lord, which is its own identity, and that's a fascinating study all of its own. And then you have, what is this? The word of the Lord. And the Lord here is the proper name for God. And so in the Jewish writing, this would be Jehovah, or as modern scholars like to say, Yahweh, which is really just a mispronunciation. And the word of the Lord came to me. So the word of the Lord's coming to Ezekiel. He's probably surprised that it's there because, of course, being exiled, they're like, all right, maybe God is against us. But you have the word of the Lord coming to a priest in an unexpected place. This is chapter 22, so we are already partway through Ezekiel's records of all these words of God that came to him. And here's what the word is talking about. I'm guessing this is a new section in the book because of this header. So this is saying the word of the Lord. And it's absolutely fascinating just to imagine a human being hearing from God and then writing down, here's what God said to me. And you, Son of Man. So the word of the Lord. And the priest's name is Son of Man. This is a fascinating term because I think, let's see if we can find it. In one of these books, I think it's the book of Mark, where Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man. Let's see. I don't know. It's in one of the Gospels, though, and if you look at the distinction in the Gospels, there's one of them that is referring to Jesus' humanity, another that's referring to his divinity, and so you have kind of four different angles on Jesus. And interesting, the same title here, Son of Man, is pulled out for Ezekiel. And the question he is asked, will you judge the bloody city? That's a question. Will you judge? Will you judge? So repeated twice. The reason why you have this repetition is for the sake of emphasis. So the focus of this question is not necessarily on the bloody city, but on whether or not the priest is going to judge the city. I wonder what his answer is going to be. So, first part, bloody city. There is something in the book of Genesis, and again, this book is foundational for how we read the rest of the text. We're going to go back to it really quick because if you have not ever reviewed these things, this isn't going to make sense. But Ezekiel, being a priest, he would have been familiar with this text. So it's part of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible. And if you go back to the very beginning, so this is about as ancient history as you get in the Bible. You have the story of Cain and of Abel, which you know somewhat. Cain was meant to be the promised son. When he was born, Eve said, this is the Messiah from God. I finally have a child. This is going to bring us back into the Garden of Eden, this land of pleasure and delight. Turns out Cain was not that one, and he ended up murdering his brother. So what I want to see here is that the voice of the brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So blood from the very first chapter, really significant thing. The next stopping point I'm going to show us is actually in the days of Noah, because God gives Noah a blessing, and you have this little section right here, which it looks like it's a quote. Is this actually a quote from God? A quote that Noah recorded and passed on? If so, this covenant that God made with Noah, which is a covenant made to every person born after Noah, because Noah being the father of all the humans that remained after the flood, if we're looking at this as a worldwide event that destroyed all of humanity, every living being except what was on the ark, a good possibility that was an if so, or at least in terms of how the story is interpreted, this covenant is very significant, and it's one that almost nobody talks about. It says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? For God made man in his own image. Now, here you have Noah, end of this story, where there is a lot of bloodshed and violence, and God destroys humanity. Now here, God says, never again will I do this. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast and from man. So here's an interesting, just fascinating, we could spend forever on Genesis 9. But blood is incredibly significant. And so when God is describing the city as a bloody city, there's a good chance that Ezekiel could have understood this in terms of explaining why Nebuchadnezzar took the city. They had killed innocent blood, and therefore they also had to be killed. So there is this idea of justice that is embedded in this book. Whether or not we like it, here's what happened, and Israel is now in exile. And here's the question. Ezekiel, will you be the one to judge? Will you decide whether this is good or evil? What is going on? What will you say about the city? If you're going to judge, then declare to her all her abominations. Wow. All right, let's see what these are. Whenever we see a word like this, we can refer back to all of the places where we've seen the word abomination come up. You get this a lot in the Law of Moses. There are a whole bunch of different things that are considered abominations. But the way that I understand this word, we're not going to go back and really dig into it, but is that there is nation at the end of it. I think abomination has to do with something that affects the entire group of people. So not just something that affects you on an individual basis, but something that affects the nation. Just an easy way of understanding that. We can dive in. I didn't come to that conclusion just because nation is embedded there. It's just a way I remember that. You shall say, thus says the Lord God. So here's how Ezekiel is asked if he will declare the abominations, by saying, thus says the Lord God. Interesting that Lord here is not in capital letters. So this is referring to Lord as in ruler, saying God is the ruler. A city that sheds blood in her midst, so that her time may come, and that makes idols to defile herself. This is what the abomination is the shedding blood in her midst, and making idols to defile. So let's continue. How do you become guilty? By the blood you have shed, and defiled by the idols that you've made, and have brought your days near. The appointed time of your years has come. So here's just another quick insight into this distinction that the people of Israel would have understood, but we don't understand because we're not familiar with the writings of Moses. This word guilt here, and let's see, and this word defilement here has to do with uncleanness. So in the book of Leviticus, which if you ever want to jump into that book, let me know. It's fascinating. But you have a number of different kinds of offerings. A lot of us don't realize that there were different sorts of offerings. There's burnt offerings, there's grain offerings. Here's a nice little summary of the types of sacrifices that were made. Just here. It's listed in the study Bible. And we'll refer this study Bible. I've absolutely loved it. Burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. So sin was different than guilt, was different than peace, was different than burnt. So, and there's different rules and different animals and different rituals that accompany each one of these kinds of sacrifices. And this word sin, if we dive deeper into it and understand what the sin offering was referring to, it's purification from realized guilt. So guilt and sin being very closely related. But you also then have these ideas of consecration. You have this idea of clean and unclean. And there are sacrifices that you needed to make sometimes in order to become clean again. And so God is referring to both of these things, both to this guilt offering, which is, we don't have time to dive into all the ways you could become guilty, but then also something about being unclean. And in this term, idols could make you unclean. This idea of idolatry. You've brought your days near, the appointed time of your years has come. Interesting. It almost seems like Ezekiel, given what he's talking about and where he's talking, it almost sounds like Jerusalem still stands at this point. And there's a good possibility. I'd be curious about that. Therefore, I have made you a reproach to the nations and a mockery to all the countries. Instead of a blessing to the nations, which the nation was supposed to be, as the descendants of Abraham there, a reproach and a mockery. So something of every nation is ashamed that there is such a nation as this in the world. Harsh. Those who are near and those who are far from you will mock you. Your name is defiled, you are full of tumult. In these days, these ancient cultures, the name was something incredibly important. The Proverbs will say, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. So your name, your reputation was incredibly important. And this had been defiled by two things: shedding blood in the midst and making idols to defile herself. Let's see more. Behold, the princes of Israel in you, every one according to his power, have been bent on shedding blood. This is amazing. Like, we live in a world, like when I read this, we live in a world that sounds incredibly peaceful. And again, I just want to pause for a moment because as this is a live Bible study, I'm also live here on YouTube, and yet, if anybody has popped in, but if you're interested in joining, in adding a comment or asking a question as we go through, please drop something in the chat. Also, let me know, if it's hard to see. I'm going to also review and see if maybe it's easier for you to go through if I'm on the computer. And we'll try this. Cool. And we'll try that again later this week and see how that works. But continuing on here, father and mother are treated with contempt in you. One of the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. The sojourner suffers extortion in your midst. So people who were traveling were taken advantage of. Extortion means charging prices that are not fair for things that they need, such as if you're a foreigner, you get charged a triple price or something like that. That would be extortion. The father and the widow, fatherless and the widow are wronged in you. So it's very interesting. It's almost like this is a thing of blood. Like the violence doesn't necessarily have to be murder per se. You have despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. These are referring to a number of 10 Commandments. There are men in you who slander to shed blood. Slander to shed blood. It's an interesting phrase, almost as if slander or the use of words is like the shedding of blood. If that's the case, fascinating what Jesus says is you've heard that it was said by those of old, you shall not kill, but whoever slanders is guilty of the same thing. We'll just take a quick look at that. Because here's the first time I've seen this in the Old Testament. Let's see. You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry, and whoever insults his brother, whoever says, you fool. I think there's more here that Jesus is talking about. But it's interesting that you have a parallel, almost like this progression from Moses to Ezekiel to Jesus. He was kind of like the mid-stopping point. There are men in you who slander to shed blood, and people who eat on the mountains. That's an interesting one. Most likely, this is referring to sacrifices, because a lot of the temples for the other gods were actually made up on mountains. So I'm guessing that's what it is. I don't think eating on mountains is really necessarily a problem for most people, especially if you have a house on one. They commit lewdness in your midst. So this is a misuse of sexuality. And perhaps this expands on this. In you, men uncover their father's nakedness. This was what Ham did. Really interesting. In you, they violate women who are unclean in their menstrual impurity. This was a very specific commandment that Moses gave, that a man was not supposed to have sex with a woman during their menstrual period. Really quite interesting. And part of this, I read this just a couple days ago, but it's back in Leviticus again, right? How much Ezekiel must have known Leviticus, being a Levite or a priest. But this meant to uncover the nakedness of the woman's womb, was to have sex during that time period. This, men uncover their father's nakedness, could refer to two things. A, what Ham did, which is really kind of ambiguous with Noah. And then what Leviticus also calls is having sex with the mother, is also a way of uncovering the father's nakedness. So interesting how he's referring to really a lot of what is in the covenant that Israel made with God. One commits abomination with his neighbor's wife. Another lewdly defiles his daughter-in-law. All of these were things mentioned in the law of Moses. Another in you violates his sister, his father's daughter. Now, this one is very interesting, and I'm just going to pause on it for a second, because if you look at the story of Abraham, and this might be weird for some of you, but Abraham was actually married to his stepsister. So you can get this, go back and take a look at the book of Genesis and do a search for Abraham, And see what happens when he travels to Egypt and the Pharaoh likes his wife. And Abraham's like, well, this isn't my wife, it's my sister. So don't kill me. You can have her if you want. It's kind of a crazy story. In you, they take bribes to shed blood. Being paid for murder, you take interest and profit. Here is something not a lot of people talk about today. We'll easily bring up all of these potential ways of misusing sexuality according to the laws of Moses, but we don't look at this idea of profit, which even up until probably like the 1500s, even banks would not take profit. And if you look at the Islamic financial system, it still looks at the idea of profit as being something that is sinful or something that is negative or against being a holy person who is submitted to God. I did an interesting study on that because I was in economics in my undergraduate studies and was curious how that related to religion. In you, they take bribes, take interest in profit, and coming down profit from charging interest to the poor. Leviticus 25. So much reference to Leviticus. We might have to go there next. So here are all of these things. People are violating the covenant that they made with God. We're not going to go into whether or not all of these things apply to us today and how they may or may not. Simply looking at these people said they wouldn't do these things. As part of their relationship with God, this is not what they do. Behold, I strike my hand at the dishonest gain that you have made. So here's the number one thing, right? We're looking at this as a rhetorical progression. Ezekiel is judging the city. God is talking about overall summary and then zooming in. Here's what the leaders do. Shedding blood. And I think part of shedding blood is kind of expanded upon. So we're expanding. You have forgotten. But me, you have forgotten. This is probably the key thing that God is upset about, if we look at other passages. But after saying all the things the city would be judged for, God says and highlights, behold, I strike my hand at the dishonest gain you have made, and at the blood that has been in your midst. These are the two things that they're being punished for. This might surprise a lot of us, who today in the church, when we think about the worst kinds of sin, we don't often think about this idea of shedding blood through mistreating people. So there's this idea of, I think we can go back to the word injustice, and dishonest gain. How many people do we know that are involved in dishonest gain, where they're taking advantage of a situation or circumstance to misuse people financially? Can your courage endure, or can your hands be strong in the days that I deal with you? These are the two things out of this whole list. God says, this is why I'm striking my hand at this. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. I will scatter you among the nations and disperse you through the countries, and I will consume your uncleanness out of you. So what God is going to do is take away the uncleanness. And as we remember, uncleanness was not the same thing as sin, was not the same thing as guilt. But what uncleanness did do was it kept a person from entering the temple or being in the presence of God. So this idea of cleansing is important. Interesting. Consume your uncleanness. God doesn't say, behold, I will punish you. He says, behold, I will help to clean you. Interesting. And you shall be profaned by your own doing in the sight of the nations, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So in other words, the reputation that Israel got was from what she did all by herself. And what is the point of all of this? Knowing that I am the Lord. The book of, it's either Numbers or Deuteronomy, has this phrase, I am the Lord, repeated over and over and over again. I am the Lord, therefore you shall do all of these things. I am the Lord, therefore you shall be this way. And because Israel was breaking all of these covenants with God, God had to do this. Then we move into a new section, because remember how verse 1 began, and the word of the Lord came to me saying? Here now we have, and the word of the Lord came to me. So once again, you have this new section. We'll go through, let's see how long this is. We'll go through this next part a little bit quicker now that we have some context. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. Once again, that same phrasing is used, which is fascinating to me. The house of Israel has become dross to me. So again, back to this idea of uncleanness. All of them are bronze and tin and iron and lead in the furnace. They are dross of silver. So God is seeing something special, something beautiful, something valuable that's covered up. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you have all become dross, therefore I will gather you into the midst of Jerusalem, as one gathers silver and bronze and iron and lead and tin into a furnace. Now, you notice how bronze, tin, iron, lead, all of these would have had a certain significance to people in that day, not only because of what they were used for, but also metals having significance. If you look at the construction of the tabernacle, the metals used in different places were very specifically chosen because they symbolize some things. A lot of it has to do with purity. And if we think about silver, where we use silver today is in conductivity of electricity. Silver is in most of our electronic devices. And gold is also incredibly valuable for this purpose, I believe. So you have the silvers becoming covered with dross, and then I will gather you in my anger and in my wrath, and I will put you in and melt you. I will gather you and blow on you with the fire of my wrath, and you shall be melted in the midst of it. As silver is melted in a furnace, so you shall be melted in the midst of it, and you shall know that I am the Lord. I have poured out my wrath upon you. It's very interesting how this paragraph is striking me right now, because typically when we think about the wrath of God, we think about an idea of vengeance or punishment or something that is not incredibly helpful. Like, you don't want the wrath of God. And in this case, it's almost like the wrath of God, this fire, is for the purpose of purifying, cleansing, of releasing the silver from what is contaminating it. It's almost like you want the wrath of God in this circumstance so that you can come out of whatever it is that has been hurting your life and keeping you from being everything that you are. It's a very different perspective on the wrath of God. I haven't really thought about it that way before. And the word of the Lord came to me. So once again, remember this is our heading section. So after the description of the judgment, you have this description of what God will do. And then you have a new section, Son of Man, say to her. Really interesting how God is using the voice of a son of man to prophesy judgment. And I think this is partly because of that Noahic covenant. Remember again, whoever sheds man's blood, by man will his blood be shed. And so God needs a prophet to declare these things so that he can fulfill them. More on that some other time. We'll see that theme emerge throughout the Old Testament, which is very interesting. You are a land that is not cleansed or rained upon in the day of indignation. The conspiracy of her prophets in her midst is like a roaring lion tearing the prey. We saw this again on my other channel, Dr. Kevin Jensen. We talked about the idea of identifying a false prophet, because this was an issue back in that day, still an issue. People who claim to speak for God, who are not. They're a conspiracy. They have devoured human lives. They have taken treasure and precious things. They have made many widows in her midst. Killed many men. This is the issue, is all of this murder and injustice taking place. Her priests have done violence to my law and have profaned my holy things. This is the idea of uncleanness. And I wonder if there's a separation. Remember up here we talk about the princes have done this. Now here, the priests have done this. Prophets and priests. Princes, prophets, and priests. These are the three people who are making the land unclean. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common. That one hits my heart. Because if you know my work with sex and spirituality, this is the heart of the Christian sexual ethic that I'm working on. Is that sex is sacred, not sinful. And almost everyone who I talk to, whether they hold a traditional view within Christianity or people who are sex educators, all focus on sex as though it was something common rather than something holy. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is to encourage making a distinction between the holy and the common, recognizing that our sexuality as part of our body, as connected and influencing our spirit, as being mediated by our mind, like being something that affects every part of us as human beings, and particularly as Christians, we are called to be holy and make a separation between the holy and the common. Neither have they taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. What is it that makes a difference? Oftentimes, the only difference between clean and unclean in the Old Testament had to do with timing. It had to do with washing with water. So things could be made clean. They could be pronounced clean. And so instead of, again, I'm building off of this. This isn't what the text is talking about here. But when it comes to sex, we can either approach it as something common, or we can learn what it means to treat it and experience it as something holy. So if you're curious about that, head over to my other channel. But for now, let's see what it is that the text is talking about. Most likely, this is referring to what's happening. For example, priests were not allowed to eat the holy bread if they had been defiled by something, particularly by death. And so, since they are involved in murder, bloodshed, and violence, coming into the temple after that would have been a violation and making things unclean, so that I am profaned among them. Also, they have disregarded my Sabbaths. Of all the themes that you see really strongly through the prophets, disregarding the Sabbath is one of the worst things that somebody in covenant with God could do. And when Jesus comes, he's like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So basically, God is like, you all are being so stupid. This day of rest was made for you. It was so you could remember that I am the one who takes care of you, so you could stop stressing out about life and actually learn to rest and enjoy it. But they disregarded this, so God is profaned among them. Back to the princes. Her princes in her midst are like wolves tearing the prey, shedding blood, destroying lives to get dishonest gain. This is absolutely terrible. Like, you understand if an entire culture is built around this idea of injustice. And given that we're talking about the princes, who are the government leaders, the prophets, who are kind of your spiritual gurus, and your priests, who are basically like our pastors of today, this whole society is going down a path of injustice. What are we going to do? This is why they all get thrown into the furnace, so that the injustice gets taken out. Her prophets have smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, "Thus says the Lord God," when the Lord has not spoken. So interesting. This is so dangerous. I mean, this is partly why I refer back here to I'm sharing what of my own opinions has been inspired by reading this text and differentiating this from what it seems the text is really talking about and focusing on. And this is what actually breaks my heart. Almost every time I walk into a church, what I hear are preachers saying, "This is what God says," when the Lord has not spoken, drawing their own opinions upon the text. And when that happens, like, how can you trust anything they say if they claim to be speaking for God? So I get this. Like, I feel a tension in my chest just reading this and imagining living in a culture like this. And to some extent, we do. There's not quite so much murder, but there is a lot of violence in our world, and a lot of it is financial. It's injustice, it's oppression of the poor, it is extortion, robbery. They have oppressed the poor and needy and have extorted from the sojourner without justice. I've been all of these. I still am all of these. And to experience this, you're like, where do you turn in a world when you find yourself without money, when you find yourself without home? Where do you turn? Where do you look to for justice? This is one of the major themes throughout the entire Bible, is this idea of justice, and God will be the one who stands up and does something about it. And that's what we've seen through this whole entire chapter. It's so interesting. And I sought for a man among them who should build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none. This verse is giving me chills. Like, I sought for a man. God was looking for one person who could steer the people, who could bring the people back to justice. This is the same thing we get back in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which I'm realizing I have a couple of videos that I need to post, because I went through and did a study of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's see where this is. Sworn in. It's back a couple of more chapters. This one right here. Right before you get to the story of destruction, God is speaking with Abraham, and ultimately he gets to this saying, for the sake of 10 righteous people, I will not destroy the city. And over here you could almost see that if there was one righteous man. It is fascinating, because the only other place where man appears here is God's reference to Ezekiel, saying, Son of man, hey, you are one of these people. It's almost like God is saying, are you going to be one to build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land? And this is another interesting thing that a lot of us miss, because when we refer to the land, we would be like, in the United States, we're like, this is the land of the free. We're not actually referring to the earth, to the soil, to the trees. To some extent we do, but we're using it euphemistically as like a nation. But oftentimes in the Old Testament, the land is referred to as its own entity, almost like it's its own being, like it's alive. And if you're like, there's no way, like that's weird. Yeah, it is a little bit weird. And if you go look and read through the writings of Moses and also through the prophets, you're going to see this theme of the land repeated over and over again, and how the actions of humans can defile the land, and the land could be destroyed, or the people could be cast out of it, or what would happen. Interesting. So God is searching for a man among the people who should build up the wall, almost like the one who is going to bring back a restoration of the covenant so that the land would not be destroyed. Parallel language again. When we're looking through the Bible, you're going to have authors who were closer to each other in time than others. And Malachi, he's probably maybe a couple hundred years after Ezekiel, or maybe not even that. But here again, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So it's almost like there's this pending sense of something happening to the land unless there is one who comes and stands in the breach, builds up the wall. God is looking for a man. I think if there's one thing I'm going to take away from this study, is that God is looking for one person. Whether that's me, whether that's you, one person who should build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land. Who is it that loves the land? Who is it that will stand up against this injustice and violence? Who is it that will look at the prophecies, who will look at the trajectory, who will look at negative things that are happening and say, not here, not anymore? Because we get to the end of this chapter, and God says, but I found none. God is looking for one. God is looking, like, absolutely fascinating. And I'm applying this to our day because I think God is the same kind of God. I think there is still the significance of justice. I think there is some shift between here and our day because Jesus comes in between, and Jesus actually fulfills a lot of what Malachi was talking about. His function, though, is a function of Elijah, the prophet, or of Elisha. I'm not quite sure which one to identify him with. John the Baptist makes that a little bit confusing. But let's conclude the chapter. Therefore, I have poured out my indignation upon them. Whom? The people of the land. So somebody needs to stand up for the land, but there was nobody to stand up for the land. Therefore, God poured out his indignation upon the people. I've consumed them with the fire of my wrath. I have returned their way upon their heads, declares the Lord God. Basically, I've let them suffer the consequences of their behavior, of their choices. And now what I see in this, again, we go back to what is talked about in this chapter, this idea of cleansing, taking away the impurity. And the writings of Moses talk a lot about how the impurity of the people defiles the land, causes some kind of harm to it. And so the people are taken away and judged and purified so that they can come back and be, so that there might be at least one among them who'd build up the wall and stand in the breach. After God exercises justice, there are going to be a man. And again, let's notice this is written from a man, Ezekiel, a priest, to other men. This is the context of the Bible as a whole. And you'll see a lot of opening up of this prophetic imagery, this idea of being a priest, is finally available to women after the days of Jesus, at least following within this tradition. Up until this point, you had women prophets, you had women judges, but you did not have female priests. And when he's seeking for a man, this is written to a particular audience who's going to be like, yeah, we're all men. Which one of us is it going to be? And so just keeping that in context, when we bring this passage and think about it in our own day, God is not just looking for somebody who has a male body. God is looking for a person, a human, a child of Adam, shall we say, a son of Adam, a daughter of Eve. One of the children that came from Noah, who is part of this covenant of justice, to look at the bloodshed and say, not here. To look at the violence and say, not here. To look at this financial oppression and say, not here. So that's the call I think I'm going to take away from this passage. So just fascinating to me, this way that it is the behavior of the priests, the prophets, and the princes that bring the judgment upon the nation. God is looking for one of them to stand up for justice, cannot find one, and therefore the wrath comes upon the people. And the way that the wrath is symbolized is in terms of cleansing, of purifying, of restoring. So fascinating there. And then getting to the end and like just having this verse stand out, which is what they do sometimes. Like, is that going to be us? And again, we go back to the beginning of the chapter. And you, son of man, will you judge? Will you judge? I think there's a lot more to this question now that we've been through the chapter than we recognize at the very beginning. Because the judge may be this one. the one who stands in the breach before me, because God does not want to destroy the land. God would prefer for the people to stand up and practice justice, to practice a way of life that shows the goodness of God. Rather than saying, hey, we're people of God and we do all these things and look at all the terrible consequences that happen because of the choices that we made. So, incredibly similar story to what we see in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to post that up in the videos today if I can go find it. And you're welcome to add some comment or question on there as well. This was an experiment doing a live Bible study stream with this book. I love doing it with this book because I'm familiar with it. This has been the Bible that I've studied on for 3 or 4 years. So it feels really special to me. But again, if it's tough to follow along, like seeing the words or whatnot, I can always switch to a digital version. So leave me a comment. Let me know if you think that's a good idea. And I'll eventually start scheduling these things. So if you decide you want to join in, take a look for those. And I have to figure out the best way to join and set up streaming. But as I do, if you have any thoughts, suggestions, open for those. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for watching afterwards. And thanks for leaving your comments. I'm excited to see what comes next. Cheers, everyone. We are ready to stop broadcasting. The stop button is not working. I think my